Yes. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are now moving into the next session. This is about protectionism. Is protectionism back? Or maybe we should have asked, how much is protectionism back? To answer that question, and also to answer how this will influence future economic growth, because it will, let's not be naive about it, we have an amazing panel. First I will, to set the stage, we have Bob Zoellick. He's the former president of the World Bank. He's also the former USTR. So he has dealt with trade throughout his life, on top of some other questions, also geopolitical ones that we touched on from the State Department. Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very pleased to be here with my former colleague Kristalina and with Frans. And this is a delightful arrangement because I've been asked to speak and then they have to answer the questions that you have about what I say. But in addition, because time's limited, and given their expertise on European matters and development, I'm going to focus on trade policy, in particular the U.S. dimension of trade policy. And I'm going to make 4 quick points and then suggest some conclusion. First, President Trump's trade policy is fundamentally different from his predecessors, at least since the time of Herbert Hoover, so from the modern age. President Trump said in his inaugural that he's a protectionist. You should believe him. The foundation for his policy, and this is the most important point to understand, is his belief that bilateral trade deficits are like a business person would consider negative net income. They're losing. Now, you don't find many economists of that view, but this is the view of Bob Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross and at least Peter Navarro in the White House. So their goal is to slash or eliminate bilateral trade deficits. And that's going to be very important because it changes the nature of their negotiations to a focus on the results and the outcome as opposed to a rules-based system. Second, trade policy is a core element of President Trump's domestic political base. Now, this is not hugely unusual, but the way in which it affects his policy is going to be significant. President Trump has been very attentive to the people who voted for him and their resentments, their interest in finding others to blame, their focus on the establishment. And so you need to see trade policy in the same context of policies towards immigration, the wall with Mexico, blocking imports that would threaten people at home. He won't want to look wishy-washy. So part of his political lesson from his predecessors is they said things in campaigns and then they kind of adjusted the course of the way. So he's going to focus on actions and on trade. It's going to in part depend on where he is on these other, loosely speaking, populist topics, his wall and immigration and others, because he's going to court that political base. Third point, watch in particular for the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and KORUS, the US-Korean agreement. The President and his administration have already focused on these agreements because the United States has a significant trade deficit with Mexico and with Korea. And Bob Lighthizer even been trying to juggle the numbers to find one with Canada, even though it doesn't really exist. The U.S. proposals on NAFTA are very important because you have a lot of people in this room who have been part of negotiations. And whether it's 60-40, 50-50, somebody gives an X, somebody gains in Y. That's not the way they're framing these negotiations given their objective. So without getting into trade wonkery detail, the NAFTA proposals fall basically into 3 buckets. One would be to open markets, primarily using provisions from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they rejected. And Mexico and Canada will likely agree and approve to these. These are, the NAFTA agreement was some 25 years old. It doesn't include e-commerce, different data protection, different intellectual property. But second, there's a series of exclusions from the rules and dispute settlement. So without going through 5 or 6 details, I'll just summarize to say these are basically designed so the U.S. can say, we have rules, you should be bound by them. When we don't want to be bound by them, we're not going to be bound by them. That's going to be a very hard sell to the other countries. And you, by the way, if you want to see an analogy to the global system, this is Ambassador Lighthizer view about the WTO dispute settlement. He wants to go back to the pre-WTO GATT system where there were panels, but countries could say, we don't like the panel, we don't want it to apply. As probably most of you know, countries don't have to do what the panel says, but then the other country gets to bring an action for retaliation. So he wants to get flexibility in the dispute settlement system. And then the third bucket is this idea of how do you manipulate market outcomes? How do you try to eliminate the bilateral trade deficit? You really can't do this in trade agreements. That's the problem. Now, what they're trying to do is use things like rules of origin. Now, it's common if you don't have a customs union like the EU with NAFTA that you have a rule of origin, but it's a North American rule of origin. What they want to have is basically a U.S. content requirement, and that's not a traditional rule of origin. That's trying to sort of adjust the numbers so as to reduce the trade deficit. It really won't work. And on top of that, I'd be quite surprised if Mexico and Canada can agree to the second and third buckets. They're not going to walk away because they don't want to be responsible. But I think we're going to run into a fundamental impasse here. And then the question is, will President Trump decide to withdraw? Under the U.S. law, he can give notice for 180 days. And notice, that's a pattern he's used. For example, you've been reading about the DACA these kids brought to the United States. He basically withdrew the position that President Obama had and sort of tossed it to the Congress. So that would be a system it's quite common for him to do. There's a big debate in the United States about the president's sole power to withdraw. Basically, because coming out of the 1930s, the Congress was normally more protectionist than the president. The president has authority to adjust the tariff levels. There's some things in NAFTA that were done by statute, but while there'll be lawsuits, the president basically has considerable authority to withdraw from the agreement. But whether he does so depends on the pushback he's getting right now. For example, from the U.S. farm community that has low prices and generally is a significant exporter, from the auto industries, which has a very integrated market with Canada and Mexico, with broader business sectors that see the benefits of trade. So for an old trade veteran like me, the one sort of consolation of this is you're now seeing members of Congress go to the White House and say, look, you really need these trade agreements. Don't end these trade agreements. Small consolation, but that'll be the question we face, going back to this question of the politics. So fourth, 2018 will also be a risky year for U.S.-China relations. So you heard Christine talk about some of the macro context and some of the other geopolitical risks. This is clearly a risk area. The United States has a big bilateral trade deficit with China. China, I think, has assessed President Trump pretty shrewdly. They recognize, given his personality and sense of self, they gave him a very big show in the Forbidden City. President Xi is in quite frequent contact with President Trump, which has kind of helped with the relations. You see President Trump every once in a while talking about North Korea from a Chinese historical perspective, and you kind of wonder where that course came from at Wharton, and it obviously comes from President Xi. And President Xi is also trying to help within a degree on North Korea. But, and this is the key point, and I actually was in Beijing 2 weeks ago making this point, don't be fooled, the U.S. is going to raise barriers, regardless. You already saw these safeguard actions for solar and washing machines. Safeguards are permitted under both domestic and sort of WTO law under certain procedures. Most of these safeguards don't really hit the Chinese so much. They hit Korea, they hit Mexico. Interestingly enough, one of the companies that is benefited by this in the U.S. has Chinese investors. The other has German investors. Shows you the kind of the nature of the system. What you'll see, in fact, there was just a news report today that the administration has also been looking at what's called a national security provision to deal with steel and aluminum. This is called Section 232. This is rarely used in the trade area because once you open the door of national security outside of true security crisis, what's not to be included? So the US or Australia's food exporters, well, people say they want food security. So this is a sort of a precedent as well as a sort of economic question. Interestingly enough, because China faces anti-dumping and countervailing duties of over 80% for most of its steel exports, it's not a major exporter to the United States of steel. About 5% of imports are from China. So of course it would hit Europe, Korea, Canada, other sort of producers. The big one is what you've heard referred to as Section 301, which is domestic law. And this is an investigation about Chinese intellectual property rights practices. Well, guess what? They're going to find a lot of bad stuff. The question, however, is what will they do about it? And frankly, I think this is uncertain even in the White House. You're seeing blowback on the steel and aluminum. Yang Zhichur, the state counselor, who Kevin knows well, was the former ambassador of the United States, is a foreign minister, state counselor. He was in Washington just last week. I attended a small dinner he had for a few of us, and he's trying to avoid a conflict, but he's also making quite clear, and this is what you should expect, if the United States does these things, China will bring the United States to the WTO, and China will start to do tit-for-tat actions. So they started an investigation on dumping of U.S. sorghum to hit the sort of farm community. The danger here is that you get miscalculations and the tit-for-tat slips out of control. China doesn't want this. It's very clear that China doesn't want it. But when you get into these areas, that's where kind of the risk to the system moves forward. So I'll close with this point. I've talked about the downside risks. But in policy, you also have to look at missed opportunities, sort of opportunity costs. And one of the unfortunate things about the U.S. stepping back from TPP is as economies change in their nature, services, different data, privacy, a lot of the issues you see on the US-EU agenda, you really need to keep trying to update rules or norms or standards. That was what TPP tried to do in some areas, and frankly, I expect if it had gone forward, you would have added some other countries. Korea, which has a free trade agreement with the US, probably would have joined, and it would have been a point of leverage to help shape China's policy on some of these issues. Now, it's a good thing, in my view, that the other 11 countries have gone forward on TPP, but it won't be the same with the US not being part of it. Another missed opportunity, and this particularly I want to stress for a European audience, is if I were in government today, I'd be focusing on China's technology and innovation agenda. China's been very forthright about this. It's in their 5-year plans, it's in the China Manufacturing 2025 plans. They identify the sectors. They want to move up value added, in part because their workforce is shrinking and they want to increase productivity. Nothing wrong with identifying those sectors. When you look at the tools, they could go very different ways. They could be stronger intellectual property rights protection. Well, we like that. It could be indigenous innovation standards that close people off. And one of the best reports on this, actually, that I've read came from the European Chamber of Commerce in China that at the time was headed actually by a German from BASF. It's called China Manufacturing 2025. And it really went into the detail of what these are about. So if I were in government, frankly, I'd be trying to work with the European Union, Japan, and others to work with the Chinese to say, look, it's understandable you want to develop these, but this could go a way that becomes conflictual, or it can go a way that there's a win-win possibility. And for China, obviously, in the long run, it wants to be part of these markets, sort of not cut off for them. For the United States, it pains me to say this, but to be frank with you, I think the United States is more interested in rationales to close off market than it is to open market. One little evidence of that, when President Trump was in China in November, the Chinese wanted to make some opening in some of the financial market for asset managers and others. They wanted to present this to President Trump. He didn't want it. And that's because he didn't want to be associated with what he considers the past mistakes of negotiating, getting a little bit, but not being significant. And frankly, I think he wants the justification so to increase markets. So the closing point here is, look, the U.S. is, sad to say, is going to create additional risks in this, and some of it depends on the tensions that I mentioned in U.S. politics, from the populist base to people on the economy that said, look, this will create conflict, including, by the way, for farm districts that voted heavily for Trump. So it's really hard to say how that will turn out. I think the fact that the TPP countries went forward, I was so pleased Japan, which has not normally been a leader in the international trade system, from some of you I've known worked on these topics, but the fact they went forward with this was a good thing. I think the fact that the EU goes forward with free trade agreements with Japan and others, you know, more power to you, because at some point the US will have to recognize that it's playing a dumb game here. The problem will be, however, at the end of the day, you have to make the system work again. And what I've described in the free trade area, I think will infect the WTO system. And just to give you one point about where the details that a lot of people don't talk about in the press articles matter, there's an appellate system in the WTO. So you have panels, you have an appellate system. There's normally 7 potential, I'm not going to call them judges so as to invoke sovereignty, but officials. And they serve on panels of 3 at a time. There's only 4 people in those slots now because the US has blocked appointment for the other 3. And of those 4, some of them are going to run out. And so, frankly, I think Lighthizer strategy is he was going to sort of depersonalize the appellate system as a way of getting to the WTO. So in that sense, we got some dangerous straits here. And so going back to sort of the Christine's context, economically things look pretty good, but withdrawing from 8 years of extraordinary monetary policies, geopolitics, and trade are the risk factors that I believe are there. So I hope you can answer the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. I was trying to thank you. Yeah, I don't give up that easily. We also have a great panel with us. As Mr. Zoellick was saying, the US couldn't have done that badly. 25% of the global GDP with 5% of the global population shows that the US hasn't been real losers in the global system that has been built since the Second World War. But we are faced with challenges. We're seeing that global trade is now at a higher level than it was before the Great Recession in 2008. We are seeing that there are protectionist measures being taken now that exceeds measures taken to liberalize the trade globally, but we are seeing then, as an answer to the stalemate and impulses we're seeing at WTO, we're seeing big regional deals coming up. With us, we have the CEO of the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva. She's also been commissioner in the EU, so she knows the EU stuff well. And first vice president of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, also former foreign minister of the Netherlands. So should we start with Kristalina? From the bank side, I guess you are also looking very much into trade as the growth engine in the world economy.
First, great to be with a former boss, and mentor. It is a great combination. And I'm going to follow up a little bit from the tack that Christine took on sweet and sour, except that in my case it would be clarity, confusion. Clarity. There is, as an organization that is based on evidence, it is so very clear that trade is good. Good for growth, good for jobs, good for income, good for the poor. And because of time, I'm not going to dwell with the evidence, but it is so very clearly there. Also, what is there is that there has been complacency, not paying enough attention to people that are left behind. I was sharing that when I came back to Washington, one thing that impressed me was how much the white American men remind me the men in Russia in the 90s. Deprived of their dignity, falling into alcoholism, decline in life expectancy, use of drugs, abuse, and of course, negativism and that huge appetite for a strong man to get us out of debt. So we have to admit that policies have to combine trade and domestic instruments that allow those who are affected negatively to cope. Confusion. This being said, we all know that the evidence on what causes people to be in developed countries to fall behind is much more technology than it is trade. And with automation and artificial intelligence coming, they're not coming, they're here. Buckle up. There has to be, in my view, much more attention to how to help societies cope, both in developed and developing countries with dramatic technological shifts. And we at the bank very strongly believe that this means significant increase in investment in people, from early childhood development to lifelong learning and elderly being able to reskill. But there is also confusion where we are on trade and what are the choices to be made. I feel very humbled to talk about that in front of Bob, who of course knows much more than me. But here is what we see today. Christine mentioned it. Actually, trade is not doing that badly right now. Of course, growth is up, trade is up. And once again, trade is moving a little faster than growth. That was not the case in the last couple of years. And in terms of trade measures, yes, the stockpile of restrictions hasn't melted, but the flow of new restrictive measures is actually the slowest it has been in the last 10 years. What is going faster, and we have to watch it, and Bob talked about it, is measures like anti-dumping, safeguards, and in particular in the United States. So the big question is, would this turn into, they're right now creeping, creep up. Would this turn into an avalanche? One country does it, another response, and then we go in that down spiral, or there would be the wisdom to actually restrain our desire to go eye for eye. And that is where I really look up to the EU, to the big economies, to their maturity of judgment, what is actually good for their people. We at the bank worry about those left behind, and especially those left furthest behind. And we so much hope that that maturity of judgment would restrain the natural instinct that you do this to me, I'm going to do it to you. But hey, that is supposed to be what happens in kindergarten, not in the big world.
No, tit for tat and beggar the neighbor is not maybe the most sophisticated policies. Frans Timmermans, representing the largest market in the world, the single market is still, I don't know if it will be the largest market post-Brexit, but
oh, yes.
It will, yes. That's good to hear. So where can EU leverage its influence? Also in this area, I think eyes are now looking at EU to take leadership also in the trade area.
First, let me say that it's just wonderful to be sitting next to my former colleague, Kristalina, again. She used to sit on the other side, but for the rest, nothing's changed, which is very, very nice. It's a treat tonight. The issue here is that if you don't look at it from a political angle, you will never solve it. The most successful slogan in European politics over the last years was "take back control." That helped bring Brexit about. And why is that happening? Why is there such a craving to regain control of our destinies across the Western world? I believe because the world is changing so fast. And we're trying to cope with the fourth industrial revolution and all the changes it brings. And then, of course, because this leads to quite a lot of, we call them populists, but I would rather call them reactionaries, left-wing and right-wing reactionaries, who then come up with ideas that the would be this illusion that there would be protection and protectionism. And then this illusion that there would not be isolation and isolationism. And it's a double mistake. But if you don't solve the underlying political problem, you will not be able to convince people. The facts on their own are not strong enough to convince people. Just look for one instant at what happened with TTIP. TTIP was the big, unknown, boring issue left to specialists until, let's say, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And then all of a sudden, this became this huge political problem, this a secret pact to destroy European societies and force us all to eat chlorine chicken on a daily basis, and et cetera, et cetera. Within a fortnight, you were able to mobilize quite a substantial part of Europeans against something that was seen as threatening to their values, which 2 years before that was completely unknown and nobody ever cared about trade agreements. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, it's true. Everyone's now looking at the European Union. We have never negotiated trade agreements as fast as we're negotiating them now. Japan, Latin American countries, China wants rapprochement at an incredible rate. That's all fine. But my problem is that underlying all of this is a societal unease about the social contract that doesn't work for large parts of our society, that will prevent democratic systems to enter into trade agreements because people will be told by others that these trade agreements do not serve their interests. So it all starts with being able to reformulate our social contract in a way that people understand that trade agreements and trade are in their interest. And many people today in Europe sadly don't, even though the tide is in our favor because of the behavior in the United States. The tide is in our favor. They all want to have great trade agreements with great, beneficial parts for Europe in it. But I'm not so sure we have the support of large parts of the European population, even for other trade agreements, because there's this underlying feeling that we're selling out our values for big business, or I don't know for whom, but not for in the interest of the people. And let me end on a very brief note. This is not something, the idea that has come back, which is how Putin thinks, which sadly is how Trump thinks, which is sadly also how increasing number of European leaders think, that you cannot have win-win. Not in politics, not in the economy, not in security. Whereas the whole idea of the European Union is built upon the idea that it's win-win. I can only prosper if my neighbor's doing well. But for Putin, he only feels secure as long as his neighbors are weak. And that's how Trump seems to see the world. He can only make America prosper if others are weaker, if others are losing. And this is, for the system we've built, because trade is not about goods, it's not about goods, it's about much more. For the system we've built, the premise that you cannot have win-win is deadly. And if we don't bring the idea back that there is a possibility for win-win, trade agreements will not work for us.
Thank you, Frans. I think this notion of zero-sum games and mercantilism was left in the 18th century, but it doesn't necessarily seem like it. I think we can have one or two questions, and then we are almost back on time. I think people are also preparing for dinner. So is there any questions, or was it so clear that Mr. Solana, maybe? On the first row here. Can we give Mr. Solana a mic?
Not a question. I want to congratulate you because you have expressed very well what I think is happening, and you haven't got the response of what should be done by us, but it's the right analysis, and now we need to have the right practice.
So maybe we'll, Kristalina and then Frans, maybe you have 1 minute each to sum up. Please.
Yeah, I thought that was the sum up. It is clear, we just need to get it done. And when we get in that area of getting it done, all of a sudden it becomes less clear. On a serious note, I cannot think of a more important topic long-term in the context of security than the topic of how we keep the world to be functioning in an integrated and collaborative manner. Both the more developed and prosperous world, but in particular the part of the world that is facing the horrible trend of extreme poverty growing. And if we have any sense of responsibility for the future of our planet and our children, we ought to find that moral high road on which to restrain the adoption of bad policies just because they are in our face. And I know that my friends in the EU are going to do exactly that.
And the whole EU was, and the Coal and Steel Union was built on a big historic lesson based on what not trading with each other could lead to. So, Frans?
Well, what has happened? The EU is built on the idea that if my destiny depends on my neighbor, I will take care of my neighbor, and vice versa, my neighbor will take care of me. Now, this premise is challenged because you believe that your neighbor does not have your interests at heart. So I depend on a neighbor who will not take care of me. And this happens within societies because the social contract doesn't work, and it happens between countries in Europe at this stage. And I think this is destructive for the European Union. I think we sometimes underestimate this element in the construction of Europe. So if you want to fix this, I think you need to understand that every industrial revolution comes with a nullification of existing social contracts. And every industrial revolution leads to new social contracts, sometimes through a period of revolution, other times through war, other times through economic hardship. And this industrial revolution is the fastest and the most intrusive one in human history. So if we are not able to understand that we need to adapt our social contracts to those new realities, which in fact is saying that we need to offer a prospect for large parts of the population that there is an optimistic place for them in that new world, if we don't succeed in that, all the other things are bound to fail and are then coming into the hands of those who sell stories on the basis of history that never was.
So, should we give them an applause? Thank you.